day, and this is the Moral Premise Storycraft Network. I'm Dr. Stan Williams, and today we're going to be talking about character transformation, goals, plots, and irony. We're going to talk about how you can take a multiple set of goals by all your characters, your plots, your subplots, and tie them all together so that they're about one thing, hopefully something ironic, something intriguing that will capture your audience's attention. So here's an outline then of what we're going to cover. First, we're going to talk about some of the basic concepts that we need to understand in case you haven't seen some of the other episodes. We're going to talk about how characters transform, how goals define plots and subplots, how the moral premise unifies goals and plots, and how irony dramatizes those goals and plots. Let's first cover some basic concepts. This is the general form of the moral premise statement, or what I sometimes call the moral physical premise statement. It's a moral physical or psychological physical statement because it encapsulates the whole concept of things that are in our mind drive our action. And so things that are in your character's mind have to drive their action. So we say that some psychological vice or some motivational value on the dark side leads to some physical detriment or something bad that happens. But there's a transformation then in that character internally in their mind to some psychological virtue or motivational value or some strength, and that leads to a physical betterment. So here we have a transformation mentally, and that translates then into a transformation that we see physically on the screen. And just to remind you all again that everything that we do as human beings, and thus everything that your characters need to be doing, first starts in the mind, and then it's translated into the physical realm. If you want your characters to do something physical, you better understand why they're doing that on a psychological, motivational level. So then again, let's just putting it into kind of a sentence form. We have some vice or weakness leads to some physical detriment, but some virtue or strength leads to a physical betterment. In other words, the psychological leads to the physical. And just one short example from some of the other episodes. In Liar, Liar, the moral premise statement is, a deceptive heart leads to rejection, but a truthful heart leads to acceptance. All right, now all of that is encompassed, or all of that affects all the different roller coaster beats in a story, whether it's the 13 basic beats or whether we add in the anecdotal beats that give us 20. Every one of those beats, whether it be a turning point, such as the inciting incident or a climax, or whether it be a sequence, like when the character rejects the opportunity and the call to the journey, or when they go through their dark night of the soul. Every one of those things is driven by the moral premise statement. And every plot and subplot of your main character, your protagonist, your antagonist, your mentor, your reflection, all the other characters, and they all have plots and subplots and goals associated with them, which we're going to be talking about here in the next few minutes. All of those things are about the same moral premise statement. So while we may have multiple characters and multiple plots and subplots, and all these different aspects and goals and lives of these characters that we're dealing with, everyone is dealing fundamentally with the same moral premise concept. And that's how your movie is unified and becomes one thing. So another basic concept is taking that linear drawing that we see here and translating it or visualizing it into the story diamond. And of course we have another episode that deals with the story diamond. You can download this graphic and the explanations at the Writing Aids tab at the moralpremise.com website. But essentially this is the overall plot of the movie, where we start in Act 1 and we have life before, and there's an inciting incident or call to adventure, and the protagonist rejects that. They finally make a decision and cross over the threshold into the special world, which is this down here, the lower half. They try to achieve their goal using the wrong method, and they don't make much progress. That's the first half of Act 2, or 2A as we call it. Then they go through a life-changing ordeal, as Chris Vogler refers to it. It's a moment of grace that causes the character to realize the truth of the moral premise that they have not been applying in their life. And when they slowly begin to make that transition, it's not nearly as sharp as this diamond shows, but it's like this smiley face down here at the bottom. Humans change slowly. They begin to use the positive side of the moral premise, if we have a redemptive film, and they start to make progress. That progress ends up being so terrific and and they're achieving their goal and getting close to it, that the antagonistic force attacks, and it looks like they're defeated here at the end of Act 2. We have what's called a false ending or faux ending, a near-death experience. And then the character goes through a dark night of the soul, and they try to figure out what it is that their life is all about and what they need to do. There's a resurrection beat. The antagonist attacks one last time in the final incident, and then they go on to prepare for the final battle, and if it's a redemptive film, they win in the Act 3 climax, and if it's a tragedy, they lose. So that's the story diamond, and all these colors represent the different story forms or schemes that different authors have come up with. So that's another episode, but just to remind you that this basic flow, this basic arc, this transformation where the character, especially our protagonist, seems to be going downhill all the way until they finally come to realize the truth of what the story is really about. And then they start to make progress back up until they're able to bring the elixir, so to speak, back into the village, as Chris Vogler talks about, and solve the problems of the world. So that's the story diamond. Now, the whole idea behind the moral premise and the structural beats that we're going to be talking about in this episode is to give you a story that has a seamless fabric. So it's all about one thing. And this applies to the protagonists, to the major characters, and to all the minor characters. And what we want to do is we want to determine what the beats are, the dramatic beats, the sequences and the turning points for each one of those characters. Now today we're not going to talk about all the minor characters. In fact, some of the minor characters are so minor that they may not have any beats. They may not have a story arc. But we do want to talk about those characters, especially the protagonist and the other main characters who have an arc, who go through a transformation. So we're going to show you how to do that and how it's all unified. So to do this, we have to know some things about our story. We can't do much of this until we kind of understand what I call the story fundamentals. Who is the protagonist, and what is the protagonist's physical goal? Who is the antagonist? And how does the antagonist try to prohibit or stop the protagonist from reaching their goal? In other words, the antagonist has a goal of his or her own. We also need to understand something about the setting, the era, the genre, whether this is a redemptive or tragic ending story, and then have some hint about who the other main character roles are and how they interplay. So the subplot and goals and ironic transformations that we're going to be talking about today can't really be determined very well until you know some of these things. Now, of course, the whole process of creating a story is iterative, so you kind of go back and forth between thinking of a unique character situation, maybe thinking of what their goals and the setting, the era might be, and then you come back and think about some of the other characters, you make a decision about whether this is going to be a redemptive or a tragic ending story, and so forth and so on. You keep working it back and forth. But ultimately, you can't do what we're going to do today until you know a lot of that stuff, at least in the back of your head, and maybe sketched it out on paper. So here's what our goal is. We want to create a story diamond. We want to create the beats. We want to know what all the beats are for all the characters, or all the major characters at least, so that we could plot them on this 8-foot tall piece of masonite. And that's what this is. This is a a story diamond that I worked out for a client a couple years ago. It's a romantic comedy, actually. And little by little, we figured out what each plot and subplot was. Made sure that they were all about the one thing, the moral premise statement. And then we placed those on this story diamond. I was able then to take that story diamond and all those little beats and subplots and those little post-it notes you see on there, and then draft them into final draft. Just lay them down into the action sequence and now start fleshing out the dialogue and everything else. So notice here in this diagram on the left, or in this list on the left, that the protagonist in this particular story had 42 beats associated with him. The antagonist, the girl interest, or the love interest in the story, had 32 beats. There was a male and female nemesis who were kind of like minor antagonists. They're like a nemesis is a combination of being both mentor and antagonist. It's like a friend who doesn't want you to run so fast. And they had 15 and 14 beats, respectively. Then there are these 4 minor characters that had 6 and 3 beats. All these together, we had 121 beats, all laid out on that board, and we had a story, and it held together. So that's our goal, and that's where we want to end up by the end of today's session. All right, so those are the basic concepts. Let's now talk a little bit about how characters transform in a general sort of way. This is, again, kind of a fundamental concept. So character transformation is about how we take psychological values and we move them into physical actions, and how those physical actions change and transform our psychological values. So we have values that drive what we do. But when we do things, we realize, gee, that wasn't such a good idea. And so it changes. It revamps our values. And then the next time we try to apply that value a little differently, and we come up with a different physical consequence after the, what we make. The way it works is that we have a value, that value drives a decision, the decision drives an action, and the action results in a consequence. And those consequences are the things that keep coming back to affect our values. And so we have this constant transformation that constantly goes on between the inner and the outer, the psychological, and that's which is invisible, and the outer, which is visible. And it continues to transform us throughout our life, and thus it transforms your character throughout the story. So here's another way of looking at that. This comes out of Chris Vogler's The Normal World and the Special World. And this, again, is the story diamond you see, kind of flattened out a little bit. So we have Act 1, then Act 2A, 2B, and Act 3, each equal in length. The top half of this reflects the normal world. So the protagonist begins in Act 1 where they normally live. And something is pointed out to them that isn't quite right in their life, something's out of balance, and they finally make the decision to cross the threshold and enter the special world. And this is where the transformation takes place. It's down here in the special world in Acts 2A and 2B. And then when they seem to learn it, even though the ending of Act 2B is typically, tragic, that gives them the information, the knowledge, so that they can come back into the normal world and rebalance their lives and correct the problem that they saw in Act 1. And so this is how our lives are. We have some problem in our life and we say, gee, I don't have the education I need, and so we enter school, that special world where we learn things, and then we come back into our normal life outside of school and apply it in our normal lives. So here's another way of looking at the same thing. At the beginning, there's some sort of problem, a cloud hanging over our protagonist. The hero has a problem, but the hero is too imperfect to solve the problem. And that's what the second half of Act 1 helps the protagonist understand. He begins to understand that he's got a problem at the inciting incident, but he's still arrogant enough not to want to change. So the second half of Act 1 is the debate that helps the protagonist understand, okay, I am imperfect, I can't do this with my current, set of assets. I've got to do something. So the hero goes on a long and transformative journey to gain new values and skills. And now that he's improved, he can come back to the real world and implement the solution. And that's the transformation from a real bird's eye view. So here's another way of looking at it. The inner and the outer, we've talked about that just a few slides before. And we might say that we start with a value. And that value is articulated in the backstory as we talk about the attitudes and philosophy that created that value in that character. Now, of course, some of that backstory and the establishing of those attitudes, the reasons for that particular philosophy of life or worldview can come in a prologue, but it can also come through flashbacks or storytelling that happen throughout the story as the protagonist engages certain situations. That value leads to a decision, the decision to an action, and that action to a consequence. Now here's the key thing. That consequence is not the result of anything that the protagonist does. It's a result of natural law. It's the check and balance in the protagonist's life. So we have some value that the protagonist has nurtured in their life or has been nurtured by parents or others in their life. And that value leads them to make some decision. That's totally of their own doing. And then they decide to take some action. That action then results in a consequence over which they have no control. And that's how our story works. And that's how the transformation works, scene by scene by scene. There's a value, a decision, an action, a consequence, and then that consequence, whether it's positive or negative, comes back to reinforce or revise the value in our character's life. So, the inner motivates the outer, which changes the inner. And isn't that the irony of the whole of every story? The irony is that we want to change something, or our character wants to change something. And so they go about changing. They go on that special journey, they go into that special world, and they begin to change what they see as wrong with the world. But that always has a consequence. And that consequence, ironically, transforms and changes the character. This is just absolutely, we can't think of protagonists as just wanting to change the outside world and that's where it stops. The real transformational journey occurs when that character sees something wrong with the world. It's really wrong with themselves. They go into the world to change it, and maybe they do make some changes. But ultimately, in the end, that comes back and changes them. And that's how the audiences really connect psychologically with the movie. They see some injustice in the world, but really there's an injustice in their own heart. They fix the injustice in the world, and in the process, they change the injustice in their own heart. So, in summary, we have an imperfect protagonist. They go through this transformational journey, and they end up being better by the end themselves, as well as achieving some physical goal and hopefully making the world better around them. The beats in a story are like this. Every beat in the story is a change, is a transformation. And we link those transformational cycles together throughout the story, and we end up either better or worse, depending on whether the truth of the moral premise is accepted or rejected. So, as we talk about these beats, whether they be a scene or a turning point, those beats, those transformational beats, are going to arc up to something better where the goal is achieved, or they're going to arc down to whether the goal is not achieved, or maybe the goal is achieved but it's a tragic goal and the character becomes worse in a tragedy. So this sequence of beats that we're talking about in terms of the plot that drives the protagonist forward can be in a number of different facets of the characters' lives. They can be in the character's professional life, their family life, their romantic, athletic, financial, artistic life. They can have to do with school, with civic activities, with travel, spiritual, social, or just about anything else you can come up with. One of these is going to end up being the primary or the main spine or the goal of the film. But a well-rounded character is dealing with all those things in their life, or at least with 4 or 5 of them that we're going to investigate in the film. And then your other sub-characters are also going to be dealing with some of those aspects in their life, and they're each going to have a goal. Every subplot has a goal, and every goal has a subplot. That's what ties goals and subplots together. And every subplot and goal is related to some particular aspect or facet of the characters' lives. Here are a few examples, but you can come up with any that you want, as long as it seems normally and humanly possible, of course. So here's then a summary of what makes a well-rounded character. A well-rounded character is a character that is imperfect. They have both weaknesses and strengths. And that applies to the protagonist, the main character, the point of view character, the antagonist. Every one of your characters is imperfect in one way, but they have strengths in another. And that's part of the well-roundedness. If your characters have only weaknesses or they have only strengths, then we have what we call a flat character. They're uninteresting. And the reason they're uninteresting to the audience is because the audience recognizes subliminally that they have weaknesses and strengths. And so they want to see on screen someone that represents them. Someone that has, they have ideals that they want to achieve, but they don't know how to do it because they lack knowledge or skills. And so the story helps them get that knowledge and skills and to achieve those ideals. Another aspect of well-rounded character is that our characters pursue things in different aspects of their life. And every aspect of that life has a goal, at least the aspects of the life that we're going to be delving with in the story. So there's a goal for every facet of their life that we explore. The multiple facets of life explored each have a goal. And thus, in every one of those multiple facets, we have a subplot, and each one of those subplots has a transformational story to that. It goes in a redemptive arc for a subplot. It goes from weakness to strengths. Or if it's a tragic, it goes from strength to weakness. Now, not every character in your story transforms weakness to strength. Even in a redemptive, good ending film that makes everyone walking out of the theaters crying and saying, oh, wasn't that a wonderful story? There are going to be characters in the story that are going to fail. They're going to transform tragically. And that is what gives your movie or your novel a well-rounded character. It becomes a character of its own. It reflects reality, and your reader and your audiences understand that. Okay, those are some of the aspects of transformation and how characters and your plots and subplots transform from a bird's eye view. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how goals define plots and subplots. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how goals define plots and subplots. Remember, I've been saying here the last few minutes that every subplot has a goal. Well, let me show you how that works out. So that red line represents a plot. And at the end of that plot, there's a goal, something that the character wants to achieve. Now, let's get complicated. Here is that same red line. And over here on the far right, number 12, that's the goal, that little red star. And this red line represents the 13 major beats of the main plot. I've got a few other things thrown in here, like the pinch points in Act 2, A and 2B, but just try to see that this is the main plot, the main spine, the physical spine of the physical story. And it has some ups and downs, ups and downs, ups and downs. Except that here at the end we expect in a redemptive story this to be up. But just kind of go along with me for right now. I've simplified the drawing. So here are the 13 beats, and notice that we have sequences, which are the odd numbers, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, and 11, and 13. And then we have turning points, which are the even numbers, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12. Turning points, again, are moments. They're scenes. Maybe they're 2 scenes, but it happens pretty quickly. And the character makes a decision. The black dots on this diagram represent turning points that are initiated by the antagonistic force. And the yellow dots are those that are initiated or decided upon by the protagonist. And so we have this ebb and flow, ebb and flow. And notice as we go through this, I've added the pinch points, that the turning points alternate. There's bad guy, good guy, bad guy, good guy, bad guy, good guy, bad guy, good guy. So that also gives us that emotional roller coaster as we move through the story. Okay, so that's important to remember, that there's this basic concept of a plot line that goes up and down, that there are sequences, and that there are turning points, and that the turning points are the consequence of both antagonist and protagonist decisions and actions. If you have too many protagonist actions in a row or too many antagonist actions in a row, the movie gets ultimately boring and it flattens out. And we have critics that say, well, it had a slow middle, or it had a really slow start, or the ending was dull, or something like that. So this is how you keep it going, that emotional roller coaster that we've talked about in other episodes. All right. So how do the subplots relate to the main plot, or to the plot? So there's that same drawing that we just saw. And here are how we might add subplots to it. Now, notice a couple things right away. A subplot is shorter than the main plot. Obvious, right? But subplots don't always start at the beginning and end just at the end. I mean, you just can do so many things in one scene, right? Our minds and our bodies live in a sequential time frame. We can't do everything at once. We're not parallel processing everything like some computers claim to do. Also notice that the subplots can start at different places. They can start in the middle, they can start at the end, they can start near the beginning, and they end at different places. They don't always have to end at the same place either. They can end in the middle, they can end at the end. You could have a subplot that is simply in Act 1 and Act 2, although I don't really show it here. And then the third thing I want you to notice is that the subplots have fewer beats. They have fewer turning points, and they have fewer sequences. Now we're going to get into that in a little bit more detail, but that's what a subplot is, and that's what I want you to notice at this point. Now, those subplots can be about different characters, or, more importantly, they can be about the protagonist. In fact, they need to be about the protagonist and other characters. But let's talk just about the protagonist for a moment. Here's just the protagonist and the main plot and the subplots. In this particular example, notice that I've got the protagonist's main plot has something to do with their civic involvement. Maybe the protagonist wants to be mayor of their city. Maybe that's their goal. And so the whole story, in terms of the main story, is about how the protagonist wants to be mayor. But the protagonist isn't just running for mayor. They have a family. They have some other professional duties. Most mayors in American cities have another job. Mayor is a small part-time job. It's not a full-time job. And so they have a professional aspect to their life. Maybe they have some artistic endeavor. That artistic endeavor might be just wallpapering the bathroom. It might be that they're trying to learn some craft like making stained glass windows or something. It doesn't matter. There's a financial aspect to everyone's life. Everything costs money, and we have some fiduciary responsibility to balance our checkbooks. So it could be that there's a subplot that deals with finances, and maybe it deals with athletics. Maybe the protagonist himself or herself is not an athlete, but maybe there's an athlete in their family, like a son or a daughter or a relative or close friend. So these are all subplots, and they all deal with different aspects of the protagonist, just the protagonist's life, where one of these subjects is the main plot and everything else colors and affects that. And you say, well, how do I come up with all those? Well, we'll get to that in a moment. Now, here's a couple other things. There are other characters in the movie, and they have subplots that start and stop at different places as well. Well, those plots, obviously, are going to intersect with the protagonist's life. Here I've got character C, a bodybuilder, that gets involved in the protagonist's life at this turning point. Down here, the bodybuilder and this girl have a relationship, and so they're during that sequence, they kind of run parallel. Maybe the two paths of two characters cross. They run again toward the end. Maybe a mentor runs along with them toward the end, toward the goal. And notice that every one of these subplots, whether it was in, I hope I have on the previous slide, yeah, notice that this is the previous slide. Notice that every one of these subplots has a goal associated with it. These are the different aspects of the protagonist's life. And then in this, here's the different aspects of these sub-characters or these minor secondary characters' lives, and they each have goals associated with them. Again, every subplot has a goal. That's what makes it a plot, is that this bodybuilder has a goal. This girl has a goal. And without that goal, you don't have a plot. There's nothing to achieve. There's no tension. There's no irony or suspense created. And those subplots may be very minor. In fact, many people in the audience may not even recognize them as goals. But that's what's subliminally happening. All right, so here's an example in Bruce Nolan's transformation from Bruce Almighty. Every subplot in Bruce Nolan's transformational journey deals with the concept, the moral concept of, am I going to be selfish and expect a miracle, or am I going to be unselfish and generous and be the miracle for others? And so the main plot deals with his supernatural relationship with God. And it's whether or not he's going to get a miracle from God or whether he's going to give a miracle to others. In his professional life, he wants to be the anchor of the television station news. But of course, he's better suited to be a field recorder. In other words, his goal is to have notoriety. And the transformation is he goes from wanting to be the anchor to understanding that his real life and his real ability to give to others is to being in the field. And that's a shorter plot than the supernatural plot. And then he has a very short 3 or 4 beat plot with his dog. And that's the goal, is to housebreak his dog. Now, there is a transformational aspect to that. I don't have the little symbol there. But remember, the dog tries different ways of going to the bathroom in the apartment. And finally, Bruce, out of frustration, realizes that he has to pick the dog up and take the dog outside. So he expects the dog to do it on his own. That's expecting a miracle. And finally, Bruce becomes the miracle for the dog and lifts him up and takes him outside. There's also the romantic subplot, whether he's going to keep Grace or lose Grace. And at the beginning of this romantic subplot, Grace is his best girlfriend. And at the end, he announces that they're being engaged, that she's now going to be his wife. And that has to do with expecting a miracle, whether he expects Grace to wait on him hand and foot and be his miracle girl, or whether he's going to sacrifice and be a loving, sacrificial husband for her. And he decides that he's going to be a miracle for her. And then, of course, there's this personal subplot that's kind of funny that spawned a second movie where he wants to get revenge on Evan. Now, the other thing I want to point out here is that every subplot has a moment of grace. That's what these yellow circles are behind these turning points. In other words, every subplot has a life before, a realization of what the moral premise is all about, and a life after. And of course, the decision made at the moral premise determines whether we're going to have a tragedy or a redemptive ending subplot. But that's the other characteristic of a subplot that you have to remember. Okay, here's another example in Catching Fire, the Hunger Games Catching Fire. Katniss, her main plot is dealing with her relationship with the Capitol. And of course, she wants to win the games. But how does she win the games? Does she, at the beginning, co-op with the capital? Or does she fight the capital? In other words, winning the games has multiple meanings to it. She either wins the games on the capital's terms, or she wins the games on the rebellion's terms. And does she fight it? That's her transformation. Her goal remains the same, but she does it two different ways. She also has a subplot that deals with mortality. That exists pretty well the whole length of the movie. It's a pretty significant subplot. And the transformation here, or the goal here, is that she needs to embrace death. She either needs to embrace death in the games or afterwards. And so when she's thinking about dying in the games, she's embracing a value of fear. But then when she realizes that she needs to do it for the rebellion and the resistance, she embraces a value of courage. She also has a subplot with respect to her family, where she wants to save her family, and that's the goal. Or down here, her romantic subplot, her goal is to find true love. And the transformation is that true love pursuit moves from Gail to Peta. And then finally, she has a subplot that deals with her public image. And she wants, all along, to earn her family's respect and the respect of her friends. But she wants to do it without anybody knowing it. She wants anonymity. She doesn't want, to be a symbol for anything. But that's what ultimately she has to transform to become. She becomes a symbol for the resistance. And of course, here the moral premise is the fear of rulers by the people lead to tyranny. But the fear of the people by the rulers leads to liberty. And that's the transformation. The people go from fearing to having courage. And the rulers go from having courage and arrogance to fearing. That's the transformation that Katniss Everdeen brings about in the Hunger Games. All right. Now here's another way of looking at all this. This little matrix that you see here represents the protagonist, just the protagonist. And we're going to explore in this movie 6 different aspects to the protagonist's life. Now we talked before about how they could be family, professional, athletic, love, and all that sort of stuff. But here, for simplicity's sake, let's just call them A, B, C, D, E, and F. Every one of those life facets for just the protagonist has a goal associated with it. And that's when we look at a protagonist's life and they have that many aspects of their life that we're going to investigate, and each one of them has a goal, with one of them being the main goal, the main plot of the movie or novel, that's what makes them a protagonist. Because everyone else is going to have fewer aspects of life and fewer goals and fewer subplots. So for instance, the antagonist might have only 3 aspects of their life that we're going to investigate. Each one of those aspects will have a goal, and each one of those subplots associated with that goal will be shorter than the protagonist's main goal. How about the reflection? There might be only 2 subplots and 2 goals for the reflection character. There might be only 1 aspect of the nemesis's life that we investigate, but it has a goal as well. And there might be only 1 romance subplot, and it has a goal in this fictitious story. But in every case, every subplot has a goal associated with it. And that's what gives every subplot tension and suspense and drives the audience forward. Now notice in this diagram we have 1 main plot and 4 subplots for just the protagonist. And that we have turning points that are scattered throughout the movie. And sometimes those turning points occur at the same time, like they do here between the purple and the red line and between the light blue and the purple line. Those occur in the same scene. But notice how these turning points are scattered throughout the movie. Every one of those turning points creates a little up or down emotional tension for the audience. And we move them all over the place, and we shove these subplots left and right to give a balance to the film. So everything's not happening at the beginning, everything's not happening in the end. But there's serious intercutting between all of these. Sometimes intercutting is parallel, sometimes it's at cross purposes, sometimes it's an entirely different plot line that doesn't seem to be connected at all. It is, because it affects the same person, and your protagonist is going to take learning from this subplot and translate it down in here into the main plot. All right, so that's the last slide in this particular subsection on how goals define plots and subplots. And now we're going to go on to how the moral premise unifies the goals and subplots. Remember, the moral premise is about the one thing, and by the time you end up writing your story, you're going to have a single moral premise statement, and it's going to apply to every character and every subplot and every goal, even the art direction and the marketing and everything else in the film. So, how does the moral premise unify goals and subplots? Here is the linear version of the 13 beats. And we want to establish plots and subplots anywhere between 3 beats and 13. Of course, you could have 20 as well, but let's say 3 at the 13. That's kind of like the ideal set or ideal limit. Now the 13 beats are diagrammed there in this linear graphic. But notice that ultimately we only have 3 beats. There's life before, which is all the way up to the middle, and then there's the midpoint or the moment of grace where there is the realization of truth, and then there's the life afterward. So you can have 13 for your main plot, or you could have beats, and you can only have 3 beats. And of course that's what this graphic represents here, where we have a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's the 3 beats. Life before, the moment of grace, and the life after. Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 in a coarse way, but ultimately that middle of Act 2 is a moment. Here in the story diamond, we have the same thing. There is a before and an after, with the realization or the moment of grace in the middle. Think of every subplot in these terms. You can make it very simple, 3 beats, or you can make it more complex with 7, 11, or even 13 beats. And again, just remind you again that we're moving between some before action, which is the psychological vice that leads to physical detriment, to an after action, some psychological motivational virtue that leads to some physical betterment. So now we want to apply this to different characters, and for the protagonist, we're going to use at least all 13 of these beats. And here are the 13 beats listed linearly like we have in other graphics. And we would use, in a redemptive beat, all 13 of these for the protagonist's main plot. But only one plot is going to have all 13. Every other subplot for the protagonist and secondary character are going to have fewer. So what do? How do we pick those? Well, here are 8 beats that we might choose for a major character who's not the hero or not the protagonist. And I've just arbitrarily picked beat number 1, life before. Then there's a climax to Act 1. There's the pursuit using the wrong motivation, a realization of the truth at a moment of grace, using a pursuit using the right motivation, and then a final incident, a hand-to-hand battle, and a climax to life or death for that particular subbeat. And the goal is reached. Here's something we might do for 6 beats. You start with those 13 beats and you say, when I tell this particular subplot or this sub-story, which ones of these fit best? I don't need to come up with them all, but as I think about this character and what they're going through in this subplot, which ones work? So here we have just these 6. Or we have just 4 beats. And of course, you could have just 3. Now, the way you do this is that you end up carding. You card the story. So you take every one of those stories, like you take your main 13 beats, and you do a card for every one of those 13 beats. And then you do the same thing for your subplots. You can put them on different color cards, or you can put the heading on the card a little different, and so forth and so on for each of the plots. So now you have all these cards. And you'll notice that as you write out those cards, and you write out the description of what happens at that turning point, or that sequence, that some of those elements are going to happen at the same time for the different aspects of their life. You're going to find where they come together. Either a sequence is going to suddenly work together because maybe two characters are riding in their car and they're working out a conflict between them, or they come into conflict at a moment of time and then go off in their different directions. Maybe there are goals that are achieved at the same time. But you card it, and you linearly place those cards on top of each other on your desk or on your wall, and you make sure that that particular story, that particular subplot follows logically right down the beats. And there might be only 4 cards, there might be 11 cards. And then you're going to place them and interleave them with the main plot of the story. So here you do the same thing. Another graphic that represents the other characters in the story. You do the same thing with them. So you're going to card out the beats for each aspect of the protagonist and each beat of each aspect for the secondary characters. Now when you get done with this, this is what you're going to have, or you have something similar. The protagonist, remember we had this diagram before. Now the protagonist we've beat out, and there's 13 beats in the main plot for the protagonist, plot A. Their subplots, there are 6 beats, 4, 3, and 3. Far fewer beats to the subplots than these different aspects of the protagonist's life. The antagonist has fewer still, the reflection, nemesis, and romance, essentially. Notice down here at the bottom the total. The protagonist has 35 beats, the antagonist 15, the reflection 10, the nemesis 3, the romance 5, equaling a total of 68 cards, or beats, major beats, for the whole story. Notice what makes the protagonist the protagonist. They have the most beats. They have the most aspects of their lives that we're investigating. We then take those cards and we put them on the story diamond. You take a wall in your house, or like you did, I made this piece of masonite, and there's a piece of PVC piping behind it with casters on the bottom so it'll slide back and forth in my office. And you start laying them out. You first lay out the protagonist's 13 beats all around that diamond. You say, well, I know where the first 13 beats for the protagonist go. They go at all these, life before, inciting incident, rejecting the journey, Act 1 climax, the decision, the crossing the threshold, the B story, and you start laying them out. And then you come and you take the next longest subplot. Maybe it's by the antagonist, maybe it's a reflection, or maybe it's just simply another aspect of the protagonist's life. And you say, okay, now that I know where the main beats of the story and how they're scattered, where do these other beats go? And you start placing them and thinking through and making sure that the subplots that you place on the board are integral and they make sense to happen just before, after, or during the other main beats for the protagonist's main plot. All right, so that deals with how the moral premise unifies all the goals and plots. It's a before and it's an after. The before and after correlate to the moral premise statement in terms of the virtues and vices, weaknesses and strengths, and you correlate those things to the simply the before, middle, and after. And when you do that, all your plots and all your subplots are going to be about one thing. So now let's look at how irony dramatizes goals and plots. Dramatic irony is simply this. The protagonist has a goal in one aspect of their life. And because that goal for that particular protagonist or character seems impossible, that's the hook of your story, there's a mismatch between the protagonist, the setting, the goal, and the antagonist. It's like little shepherd David in a loincloth going up against Goliath, a war-hardened fighter with armor and a big sword and a helmet. We expect something to happen in that situation. There's the goal. David wants to defeat Goliath. But there's a natural expectation that this is not going to work. That's the hook. It's something impossible. You take something impossible, and through your storytelling craft, you make it possible and probable and realistic. What actually happens is success. The natural expectation is thwarted, and our protagonist achieves success. That's the opposite of what's expected, and that's how you get dramatic irony. Now that all happens because way early in the process, when you first thought about this story, you thought about a hook, and you thought, I've got to put two opposite people together, or I've got to put a person in an impossible situation. I want to create irony by putting the protagonist in a situation where the audience is going to expect naturally failure. And then I'm going to surprise them. I'm going to create suspense and intrigue and make the opposite happen. So here are two examples of how this happened. And these are both Oscar award-winning screenplays. In Django, essentially the log line is, in 1850, an uneducated American slave and a well-educated European dentist team up to go bounty hunting. That's dramatic irony, to put these two guys together. Because who are they bounty hunting? They're bounty hunting slave owners in the South before the Civil War. This is absolutely a crazy concept. But because of it, because of that dramatic irony, the script nearly writes itself. In the King's Speech, at the time of an international crisis, a fearful king cannot speak with or of courage. So here is a king who is fearful of being the king. And that's his weakness. And it's the incredible irony that how can you imagine that a man in the royal line for the throne in England stutters so badly that you cannot have any confidence. But yet he comes upon a situation, and fate and history throws him into a situation where where the fate of his nation is at stake. And he has to have the courage to learn to speak. So you take those situations and you have these wonderful moral premises. In Django, 2012, best script, having no plan leads to brutal times, but having a good plan leads to thriving times. So the irony there is brutal times versus thriving times, slavery versus freedom. In King's Speech, which is articulated by Lionel, fear leads to stuttering and no audience. Abdication, which King George's brother does, right? He abdicates the throne. But confidence leads to a clear voice and plenty of listeners, and that's kingship. So the irony there is, am I going to abdicate the throne? Which our main character does early on in the movie. He doesn't want anything he's second in line, he doesn't want anything to do with it, but then his brother abdicates, literally. And he can't abdicate now. Now he has to step up and become the king. So the point here is that dramatic irony naturally leads to these 7 things. Immediate and universal conflict, nuanced and unexpected dialogue, unconventional action, plot surprises, even to the writer when they're writing it, new discoveries about the characters and the culture and the setting, characters that are transformed, and the most important, or the all-encompassing, the impossible is made reasonable. And that's what I believe is the secret to winning an Oscar for the best story. You take something that is absolutely ironic, and then you cleverly write it to make it reasonable. All right, that wraps up what we've been doing. We've talked about the basic concepts of goals, plots, and irony. We've talked about how characters transform, how goals define plots and subplots, how the moral premise unifies goals and plots, and how irony dramatizes goals and plots together. So don't forget, we've got some great looking mugs that can remind you about some of these things for sale on our site. I've sold very few, so I don't expect you to buy any, but they're cool nonetheless. And I use them. And of course, don't forget to visit the Moral Premise website with this complicated menu down here of all this stuff. There's a lot of good information there that can help you become a really great writer. Thanks very much. See you next time.